Rich man mocks a black janitor's lunch. Moments later, he's left in tears by what's revealed. He thought it was just a joke. A rich executive in a spotless suit, laughing at a black janitor's cheap lunch in the company break room. To him, it was harmless, just another reminder of who he believed was above and who belonged below. But what he didn't know was that this lunch, this man, and this moment would expose everything he never understood about privilege, sacrifice, and dignity. Because when the truth behind that embarrassing meal is revealed, it leaves him in tears. So what was really on that plate? Every morning, before the city was fully awake, the building gleamed like a monument to success, glass, chrome, and money. Inside, Marcus moved quietly through its empty halls, pushing his cart, wiping away yesterday so the executives could step into today without ever thinking about who made it spotless. He took pride in it, not in the title on his badge, but in the fact that his work meant his mother's medication was paid for, that his son's school lunches were covered, that the rent barely stayed up to date. Long before anyone in a tailored suit arrived, Marcus had already put in hours. Tucked into the bottom of his cart was the same old plastic container he carried every day. The lid was a little warped, the sticker on top half peeled. Inside was a meal that looked simple, even cheap to anyone who didn't know better. To Marcus, it was more than food. It was a piece of home, a story, and a sacrifice, all in one small box. On the top floor, a different world was waking up. Premium coffee machines hissed, polished shoes clicked on marble, and the company's star executive stepped out of his private office, checking his reflection in the glass. He barely noticed the janitor, who had been there since dawn, just as he barely noticed the security guard, the cafeteria staff, or the woman who emptied his trash. Their paths were about to cross in the one place everyone shared, no matter their salary, the break room. Marcus only wanted 10 quiet minutes to eat. Someone else saw an easy target. The break room was the only space in the building that felt almost equal. Same humming refrigerator, same humming lights, same scuffed tables, no matter what was printed on a person's business card. Marcus slipped in during the mid-morning lull, shoulders slightly hunched, trying to claim his 10 quiet minutes before the rush of suits flooded the room. He set his worn container on the table, peeled back the lid. And that familiar smell rose up, comforting, heavy with memories. It reminded him of a tiny kitchen, a crowded table, and hands that had once stirred the same food with love and exhaustion. It reminded him of why he was still trying. The door swung open with a confidence that announced itself before the man even appeared. The executive from the top floor stepped inside, phone in hand, designer watch catching the fluorescent light. He moved like the room already belonged to him. His eyes landed on Marcus, on the faded uniform, on the dark skin, and then on the plastic container that didn't match the sleek minimalist lunchboxes lining the counter. Amusement spread across his face, slow and cruel. He moved closer, not to sit, but to inspect. His gaze flicked between Marcus's meal and his own reflection in the microwave door. The difference between their lives seemed to entertain him. He made a show of the smell, a show of the cheapness, a show of the fact that someone like Marcus had so little while he had so much. A couple of coworkers drifted in and noticed their expressions shifted from indifference to curiosity, then to laughter that grew bolder with each passing second. No words were needed. The pointing, the wrinkled noses, the exaggerated gestures said enough. The joke was clear: the black janitor, the poor man's meal, the unspoken assumption that this was all he would ever be. Marcus felt heat rise in his face. He stared at the food that had once meant home and safety, now turned into a spectacle. Each chuckle landed like a slap. He reminded himself why he was there: his mother's prescriptions, overdue notices on the kitchen counter, the promise he had made to his son that things would get better. He tried to shrink into the background, the way he had learned to do since he was a boy, when being invisible was sometimes the only protection he had. The executive lifted his phone, angled just right, framing Marcus, the container, the uniform. Fingers moved quickly over the screen. A photo, a caption, a joke designed for people who lived in his world of private gyms and rooftop parties. People who would never see the inside of a night shift or a bus ride home after midnight. In seconds, Marcus's humiliation left the room and entered an audience he would never meet. He didn't know that a barista who liked Marcus had seen the entire thing from the doorway. She watched the photo being taken, watched the smug satisfaction, and quietly pulled out her own phone. A different angle, a different story. On the top floor, the executive's phone began to buzz with notifications. Friends, colleagues, even clients reacted with amusement and approval. To him, it felt like harmless fun, a way to break up the boredom. To everyone who looked like Marcus, it was something else entirely, a reminder of how easy it was for dignity to be stripped away in seconds. Downstairs, Marcus tried to finish his meal, each bite heavier than the last. He packed the container back into his cart and went back to work, carrying a new kind of weight through the hallways. He didn't know that his face and his lunch were now traveling through the building faster than any elevator. By lunchtime, the post had reached someone it was never meant to reach, a senior partner with a different history, a different memory of being mocked for the color of a parent's skin and the food on their plate. And with one quiet message sent and one urgent meeting scheduled, the man who thought it was all a joke was about to face a truth he could never have prepared for. The email hit his inbox with a single word in the subject line that made his stomach tighten. Urgent. Minutes later, he stepped into the glass-walled conference room on the top floor, expecting a routine update. Instead, he saw the senior partner waiting, an HR director beside him, a large screen glowing at the end of the table. On it was his own poster photo of Marcus, the close-up of the plastic container, the mocking caption, and a flood of comments that treated a black man's dignity like a punchline. Next to it, another image appeared, the barista's photo. A wider angle, the executive standing over Marcus, expression amused, posture towering. Marcus shrinking into his chair, shoulders folded in on themselves. The contrast said everything he had refused to see. He listened as the senior partner laid out what had happened in that break room, what witnesses had described, what the comments under his post really meant to people who had grown up being laughed at for their food, their clothes, their skin. He heard his own behavior described back to him not as a joke, but as humiliation built on a history he had never bothered to understand. Then Marcus was brought in. He walked into the room slowly, uniform still on, hands rough from work most people tried not to notice. He looked from face to face, unsure why he'd been called there, bracing for bad news he could not afford. Instead, they asked him about the meal. He spoke quietly about the dish in that worn container, how it was the only recipe his mother could still remember after her stroke, how he cooked it for her every night, before coming in to clean the offices of people who would never know her name, how it was cheap because every extra dollar went to her care and to his son's school supplies, how in his family, that poor meal had once meant survival when there was nothing else. As Marcus finished, the room fell into a heavy silence. The executive felt something crack inside his carefully polished image of himself. The joke he'd posted, the laughter it had earned, the casual cruelty he'd wrapped in smug amusement, all of it stood naked in front of him now, tied to a living person with a history, a mother, a son, and a lifetime of being judged on sight. The tears came before he could stop them. For the first time, he saw that what he had mocked was not a lunch, it was a life. The meeting ended, but the impact did not. The executive left the room not as the untouchable star of the company, but as a man forced to face what he had become. An internal investigation followed. His post was deleted, but the screenshots were not. He was removed from public-facing roles, placed on leave, and required to sit through trainings and conversations he once would have rolled his eyes at. This time, he listened. Company-wide, the incident could not be buried. An email went out explaining that a staff member had been humiliated because of his race and background, that this behavior violated more than just policy, it violated the basic humanity the company claimed to stand for. For employees who had stayed quiet for years, it was the first time they saw their experiences named. Marcus returned to work the next day with the same uniform, the same cart, and the same container in the bottom tray. But something around him had shifted. People who used to walk past him now looked him in the eye. Some were uncomfortable, some ashamed, some quietly grateful that for once the problem had not been brushed aside. He agreed to speak at a staff forum, not because he wanted attention, but because he was tired of swallowing pain in silence. He talked about growing up being mocked for his skin, his hair, his food, about learning to make himself smaller so others could feel bigger, about how that one photograph had ripped open a wound that never really healed. The executive sat in the back, listening to every word. The story did not fix everything. Marcus still worked nights. Racism did not vanish from the building, but a line had been drawn, a mask pulled off. No one could pretend anymore that these were just jokes without history or consequence. In the end, this was not only about a lunch or a single cruel moment. It was about all the times dignity is chipped away when no one is watching, all the harmless comments that carry generations of harm. The question that hangs over this story is simple and heavy. The next time you see someone's humanity turned into a punchline, will you stay silent or will you refuse to laugh?